Welcome to the first of 4 Western Cover Crops Council's Intermountain Subregional Conference from the Ground Up webinars. My name is Steve Hines, and I'm an extension educator for University of Idaho, and I'm located in Jerome County, which is in the south central part of the state. And of course, we have to thank Western SARE for the funding for the grant to make all of this project possible. So for our second presentation today, Cover crop use in the Intermountain West and Northern Rockies, a regional survey result, I'd like to introduce Lauren Golden. She is now completing her dissertation, which focuses on cover crop use in the West and the policies in place that incentivize farmers to adopt conservation practices. Welcome, Lauren.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Steve, and thank you all for joining us today on this webinar. The Western Cover Crops Council in 2020 embarked on a survey to understand use of cover crops in the West. And this was part of a Western SARE funded project. So essentially the Midwestern Cover Crop Council and the Northeast Cover Crop Council had done some similar surveys to garner data on how many people in those regions were using cover crops. And essentially in the West, there really was not a data set that kind of encompassed how many farmers in the West were using cover crops, what motivated farmers to use cover crops, and more importantly, what were some of the barriers to this region? As highlighted, it's a very diverse, large region, and the way we use cover crops is different than areas in the Midwest and in the Northeast. So with my time with you today, I'm going to share some of our survey results. So how can we produce more food on less land with less resources? So essentially, this is the wicked problem facing the agriculture industry. We know that growing populations will require us to produce more food. We know that viable land is declining and soil health is declining on that land. And we know we need to do it with less resources. And we know even on an individual level, we need to make decisions that look at our carbon footprint. Well, to tag on to that, data suggests that agriculture is the #1 contributor of non-point source pollution in US waterways. Now, that has been most evident in large water bodies such as the Chesapeake Bay or the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, where this image is seen. And in some summers, that dead zone can be as large as the state of New Jersey. And we all know that industry and homeowners also add to that nitrogen and phosphorus levels in our water, but essentially agriculture is the #1 contributor of that. To add to that, we know climate change threatens the world's food supplies, which means farmers are constantly facing new norms, which means farmers are having to reevaluate their management systems and management plans. Now we know water quality and why we're concerned about non-point source pollution is not only does it impact water for our own human consumption, but we know it has degradation on aquatic ecosystems. Well, I bring that all up because that brings us here today, which Jeremy so pointedly talked about. Cover crops are not necessarily the panacea of solving some of those agricultural issues that I just mentioned, but cover crops are essentially the best tool in our toolbox. Now that's because cover crops do a variety of things. Most of us in this room are probably familiar with some of those benefits, but I'll mention a couple. The conversation after mine will highlight data has shown that in some cases, cover crops can increase soil moisture, which is important for the West. We know that cover crops add organic matter and an organic source of nitrogen to our soils. We know that cover crops can reduce erosion by improving soil structure and having a material on the ground to eliminate soil movement. We know cover crops can reduce soil compaction through their roots. And most importantly, we know that cover crops can help reduce leaching, essentially of the inputs we add to our farm. Cover crops can help essentially slow or eliminate that leaching process. Now, cover crops have received considerable attention by not only ag professionals, but farmers like yourself and the federal government for the reason that cover crops are so effective at reducing non-point source pollution. And to deal with non-point source pollution on such a large scale when it's like the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico or the Chesapeake Bay, it's essentially cost prohibitive. So the best case scenario is to help prevent leaching on each individual farm. which is why cover crops are so heavily pushed within the United States Department of Ag. So the Western Cover Crops Council, as you all learned about, as well as all of you in this room, we're all pretty enthusiastic about cover crops and the potential they can have for not only farmers, but also on a large societal scale in terms of helping to improve some of the environmental issues associated with producing food. So with my time with you today, I'm going to highlight how we conducted our survey, and then I'm going to jump right into the survey results, which essentially was, what's the rate of cover crop use in the West? What motivates farmers to use cover crops in the West? What are some of the barriers seen by farmers in the West? How do farmers access information about cover crops? And then I'm going to end with policy in terms of looking at how the federal government incentivizes some of these programs through a cost share cover crop program. So essentially we asked a digital survey via Qualtrics, and it was about 60 questions, and it ran from April to June of 2020. So we were luckily able to capitalize on that first stay-at-home order for a lot of people in the US. So we were fortunate to have a decent response rate. We had over 900 farmers respond to this survey, which is a good response rate for a survey of this size. Essentially, it took about 10 to 15 minutes for each farmer to complete. We sent this survey out to farmers in the West. And if you think of that, about that map that Jeremy showed, those blue states, those are essentially the Western region that we targeted. And we advertised this survey through Facebook. We use agricultural listservs. We used our network within the Western Cover Crops Council, and we used various agricultural organizations that were essentially willing to share that survey link in their newsletters or various email blasts. So let's jump right into our survey results. So baseline data, cover crop use in the West. Essentially, we asked farmers, have you ever used cover crops before? Yes or no. And good information was found. We found that 72% of respondents indicated they had used cover crops before or perhaps regularly used them, whereas only 28% of farmers in the West indicated they had never used cover crops before. Now, I'm going to tease out that data and just focus on this mountain range, or essentially the Intermountain West / Northern Rocky Zone, Colorado, Montana, Wyoming, Utah, Idaho, and Nevada. And we found similar results. About 68% of those farmers indicated they had used cover crops or have used them before. So all in all, this was good data to find that we can say that around 70% of Western farmers have used cover crops or are regularly using them. And that's a good starting off point as we look to continue to expand cover crop use in the West. Now, we also asked farmers how many acres of cover crops they had planted in the period between 2016 and 2020. So the good news is this bar graph indicates that, or this line chart indicates that the acreage is going up. The earliest data point was 2016, where we asked how many acres did you produce? And farmers indicated they produced around 30,000 acres. And now we can see in 2020, those same respondents have upped their acreage by more than 20,000. The mean acreage for survey respondents was 850 acres. We had some small scale farmers with 1 to less than 10 acres. And then we had some very large scale farmers with indicating they had farmed 50,000 acres. So the mean was around 850 acres. And the good news is we can see that that acreage is increasing. Next in the survey, we asked what motivates farmers in the West to use cover crops. I mentioned some of the benefits that we all know about, but we essentially asked respondents to rank on a Likert scale, 5-point Likert scale, whether you strongly agree or strongly disagree with these beneficial statements. Do cover crops increase soil health? Do cover crops help you control weeds? Do cover crops reduce runoff? Do cover crops increase soil moisture? Do they reduce soil erosion? And do they help support pollinators? So essentially this index gave us how motivated farmers were to using cover crops if they leaned on the side of strongly agree with many of these motivating statements for strongly disagree. So let's see what we found. Now on my y-axis, you can see we have our scale of strongly agree at the top, all the way to the bottom of strongly disagree. And this is just for this region, again, for this mountain region, Intermountain West, Northern Rockies zone. And what's nice to see is that all of the 6 motivating statements we presented to farmers, it looks like farmers primarily agreed with these statements. So most farmers who took this survey agreed with these beneficial aspects of cover crops. And the top 2 were reduced soil erosion and increasing soil health. So we can see that for this, and that's useful in the sense of knowing what is most important in terms of farmers wanting to use cover crops. What goal are they primarily looking for? And we could say that it looks like they agree with all of these statements, but the top reducing soil erosion and increasing that soil health. Now that's nice to know what motivates farmers, but it's also really important to know what are the barriers. So that way, as we continue to build out our outreach, build out research, and build out information on cover crops, what's the biggest barriers we need to overcome? So in a similar fashion, we asked farmers to rank whether they strongly agreed to strongly disagreed with these barrier statements. And we garnered this from the literature as to what are common barriers with cover crops. And we also knew from working with farmers what were common barriers in the West. So that's essentially how we created the questions we asked. So for example, do you agree or disagree that cover crops are hard to establish? Is your growing season too short? Are cover crops expensive? Do cover crops reduce yield in your cash crop? Do cover crops increase disease? I don't have time. I lack the equipment, and I have inadequate knowledge. So the biggest barriers in this region, you can see on the x-axis, we have one being strongly agree, which would indicate someone strongly agrees that that is a barrier in terms of their use of cover crops. And strongly disagrees means it's not really a barrier and it's not impacting my use of cover crops. We can see that the top 3 are expensive, I lack the knowledge, and I lack the time. And what's important here is that these are things that we can potentially do something about. For me, for example, working in Idaho for many years, short growing season was our biggest barrier. So that's interesting to see that that ranks least or lower on the barrier scale for farmers. And that's something potentially we would have trouble dealing with in terms of how do we plant cover crops in an already short window of time with an already limited rotational option. So what's interesting again is to see that the top 3 are some things that we can perhaps tackle, whether that's through policy or whether that's through more outreach. And lacking knowledge and lacking time, we know are probably going hand in hand. You might lack the time to spend the energy researching cover crops, reaching out to other people, getting on the internet, opening publications to find out what works for your system. Now, let's look at that same exact data, but look at it for the entire Western region. And this graph is the exact same in terms of the axis and the barriers listed, but what's important to note is that the top 2 remain the same. Biggest barriers are that cover crops are expensive and I lack the knowledge. Essentially what flip-flopped for 3rd place was lacking time, flip-flopped with hard to establish. Now on the bottom of the barrier scale, growing season is too short and increasing diseases remain kind of on the bottom in terms of being a large barrier to overcome for many producers in the West. So I want to jump into these barriers of expensive and lacking knowledge. So to summarize real quick, motivations, we can say that all of the motivational statements about cover crops seem to be agreeable. Most farmers seem to recognize those benefits, which indicates they're probably more likely to more motivated to grow cover crops. And the top 2 were soil erosion and increasing soil health. In terms of barriers, it's nice, it's not nice to see, but nice to see that the top two are expensive and lacking knowledge, because perhaps those are some two barriers that we can help do something about. Luckily for us in the survey, we also asked farmers how they access information about cover crops, which ties into that lacking knowledge. Where are farmers seeking information? So if they're lacking knowledge, where do we need to target our information and outreach in terms of cover crop research and use? So we asked on our Y scale, you can see we asked farmers how often they source these various outlets for cover crop information, whether that was often, sometimes, seldom, or never. And the information sources we asked about were the internet, other farmers, agricultural publications, extensions, workshops/conferences like today, university research, field tours, local NRCS, soil conservation district, industry groups, and NGOs. We could see that the bottom two on the right-hand side are industry groups and NGOs, meaning farmers are seldomly seeking information from those sources. And soil conservation district and local NRCS are also on the right-hand side, indicating a least outlet. On the left-hand side, we can see what's ranking high. We can see that the internet is the most highly ranked outlet for accessing information. Second is other farmers, and then agricultural publications. Now, we assume farmers, although they were in the midst of a pandemic and at home, we assume they answered this survey in terms of what do they normally do under normal circumstances, how do they access information. We know internet, regardless, is a pivotal source for all of us in terms of acquiring information. It's easy, it's fast. We don't necessarily know if internet meant YouTube videos. It could have meant publications, blogs, various things like that. But internet ranked the highest, which is not necessarily a huge surprise. But what is nice to see is that second place was other farmers. Now, I don't show this here, but another statistical test I ran was looking at these same access points of information to see how well they predicted a farmer would use cover crops. And in that particular test, other farmers ranked the highest. And that meant that a farmer who more regularly sought information from other farmers were 2.5 times more likely to use cover crops. So it's important to say that the survey indicates that other farmers are an important conduit of information sharing, which Jeremy highlighted. The Western Cover Crops Council is looking to help build out their platform of farmers and ag professionals to help share information about cover crop use in these different climates of the West. So that way we're all learning from each other and learning from specific climates and specific cropping systems that work for us. So I'm going to end a little bit with what about policy? So in the beginning, I mentioned that the federal government pushes cover crops for the various conservation practices that cover crops provide, but that number one benefit being their ability to help stop non-point source pollution. So essentially, why cover crops are such an interesting conservation practice is because they can have a win-win. They can win out for farmers by helping to improve their soil health, helping to improve their long-term soil fertility, but then it has this large-scale societal benefit to helping to improve water quality issues associated with agriculture. Other conservation practices are not such a win-win for farmers, such as taking out land or expanding your riparian zones. Those are all good from a conservation standpoint, but not often great for the bottom line for a farmer. So cover crops are really a win-win and very interesting in that regard because they can have this large-scale benefit, not only for the farmer who adopts them, but also for those water quality issues and other environmental issues. So the federal government promotes cover crops, and some of you might be aware of these programs and some of you might not. But essentially through the NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Services, there's a program called Eqip, which stands for Environmental Quality Incentives Program. And essentially incentive is that key word. where the federal government wants to incentivize farmers to adopt conservation practices because of these large-scale benefits we can see. So, research has shown that most farmers who use cover crops don't participate in this Eqip program, essentially this cost share program. So we wanted to ask that in our survey to see if we found a similar result as to were farmers in the West utilizing this program. And we want to be able to use that data to help inform that program and that policy so it can be a better tool and a win-win for farmers. Well, first we asked if you were aware of the Eqip cover crop cost share program. And in our survey, we found that 61% said they were not aware of it. Well, you can't really participate in a program if you're not aware of it. So that's good information to know, is that most farmers were not aware of this program. For those who were aware of the program, we then asked, how many years have you participated? And essentially the biggest segment in this pie chart in yellow is 0 years. So 56% of the farmers who were aware of Eqip said they had not participated. And then the second largest pie in this pie chart is the pink, which is 17%, which was only 1 to 3 years. So in general, we can say that most farmers in the West are probably not aware of the Eqip program, and those who are not participating or have not participated for very long, which falls in line with what other research has found in terms of participation in these programs. Now, I don't have as much time to dive into this, but we did ask those who were aware of it and those who had participated, whether that was 0 years or more, we asked, what are some barriers you've experienced with the Eqip program? The largest square in this chart is essentially none. And that's probably those 56% of farmers who have never participated. They don't know what a barrier might be because they haven't participated. But some of the others who have participated, they indicated the inflexibility of the program. An example of that would be farmers might have an idea of what cover crop seed mix they want to use, but the NRCS won't necessarily approve that, and the NRCS would require them to use their set seed mix. And I think some farmers don't necessarily like that, and they want a little more flexibility with the planting date and perhaps that seed mix. Other barriers indicated in this survey were the paperwork, meaning the time it requires to fill out that paperwork and provide the documentation for the federal government in terms of receiving that essential cost share. Staff still learning was another barrier indicated, waiting time, program clarity, and NRCS has limited resources. So essentially it's hinting at the NRCS staff perhaps needing more funding to promote the program and also make it more clear and effective or efficient for producers to participate in. So this is just a hint at some of the things we found in terms of the Eqip barriers. And why we wanted to ask about that is because, again, we want to help inform this policy. The whole purpose is to help farmers or help share the burden of farmers adopting some practices that they might have to experiment with a couple of years before they really get it down. Well, how can we inform this policy if most farmers are not participating in it? And if they're not participating, what are those reasons? And if we look back at our barriers of lacking knowledge, perhaps some of the cost share funds can be used for more outreach, if that's one of our biggest barriers, in addition to cover crops being expensive. In summary, again, this data set helps the Western Cover Crops Council have a baseline data set of how are cover crops being used by producers in the West? How many producers are using cover crops? What are barriers and what are motivations? And essentially we can say that 70% of farmers in the West have used cover crops or regularly use them. And that's really a good number to see. We know that reducing soil erosion and increasing soil health are the top motivators for this region. And overall, we can say that cover crops being expensive and farmers lacking knowledge being the top two barriers for farmers to expand or even use cover crops in the beginning. And another important aspect that I want to highlight is that farmers are found to be an important conduit of information. And we know that in the past. We know that research has found that farmers spreading knowledge about what's worked for them, what hasn't worked. But I want to highlight that in terms of the Western Cover Crops Council as they continue to build out their farmer network. And for you farmers that are on this webinar, helping spread the word about cover crops, help the Western Cover Crops Council spread the word about what you've done in your particular climate or your particular region. So that way we can eliminate some of the experimentation that it requires for new farmers to find out what cover crops work best for their system, what are the management tools they need to use. Again, perhaps we can reduce that cost of cover crops by eliminating some of that initial experimentation that it sometimes requires for farmers as they get started with this new practice. So with that, I have some time for some questions, and my email is on the bottom of this slide, so you can also email me questions as well.